They exposed his deceit. What transpired at 8 Andatsa also validated all the theories that the XRP community had been developing over the past several months. Not the simplistic account that the major financial media outlets used. It wasn't the kind of headline that regular investors cared about, so they ignored it. What transpired at 8A was a government move with a hidden signal that, when unraveled, exposes a plot that has been simmering for far longer than most in this field are aware of. I intend to unravel the scheme today. I will explain what the 8-0 order was, and why calling the bluff on it was a smart move rather than a setback. What the evidence-based analysis of the U.S. government's involvement with Ripple's technology and XRP reveals, the connections between the government's strategic timeline and the institutional positioning of XRP and the potential price targets once the plan being deciphered tonight is finalized. Every piece of information I use is sourced from documents kept by the government, orders made public by the government, disclosures made by institutions, records from Congress, and data stored on the blockchain. Just so we're clear, this isn't financial advice. For educational purposes solely, I am giving material that is publicly available. Before putting your money into the market, you should always perform your own research and talk to a competent financial advisor. Because knowing what was on the table and why the time is just as important as the content is the first step in comprehending what transpired, I'll begin with the 80 order itself. No government agency ever issues an order in the digital asset arena without consulting one another. Each order lays the groundwork for the subsequent order's legal and regulatory requirements within a predetermined policy framework. While the 80 directive has received a lot of attention from the XRP community, its real significance lies in its place within the chain of executive and regulatory acts that have been constructing the current administration's digital asset policy framework. There is an eerie degree of intentionality and precision in the execution of the 8A order, when compared to the preceding actions: commodity classification, CFTC framework guidance, executive orders creating the digital asset working groups, and the Clarity Act legislative timeline. The challenge to the authority of the order was the bluff that was called. This is why the naysayers were wrong to say that calling bluff was a setback. A policy architect may foresee or even plan the role that a challenge to an order will play in government policy. Once an order has been challenged and then upheld, its legal power is much stronger than it was before. The challenge was intended to create ambiguity, but the judicial or legislative procedure that resolves it generates precedent, documents the order's legal grounding, and eliminates it. The administration was able to consolidate the legal architecture that the order was meant to construct thanks to the citizens who called their bluff. The purpose of the aforementioned Digital Asset Policy Directive was to lay the groundwork for the institutional adoption of Ripple's technology, the Clarity Act's legislative mandate, and the commodity classification of XRP to function with legal certainty. That certainty is now more robustly provided by the judicial record that was established as a result of the challenge to that order, rather than by the order alone. A bluff was instituted, someone played the hand, and the end result was a more solid legal groundwork for subsequent events. Let me now go over the proof that a plan has been underway, since proof is what differentiates analysis from conjecture. The administration's digital asset executive orders and Ripple's court victories occurred at roughly the same time, which is the first piece of proof. In July 2023, the court partially sided with Ripple, ruling that the sale of XRP to individual investors did not constitute a securities transaction. Shortly after, the present administration issued its first major executive directives, creating digital asset working groups. The timing of that is not random. Policy action could not have followed Ripple's judicial triumph without first establishing clear legal precedent. If the asset's legal status is unclear, it will be impossible to establish regulations for it. The court provided the executive branch with the necessary legal authority. On the regulatory framework, the government made a move. Everything was prearranged. Second, XRP is clearly classified as a commodity by the CFTC. Prior to asset classification, the Commodity Futures Trading Commission conducts thorough internal investigations, consults with attorneys, and collaborates with other regulatory bodies. There were other government agencies that also decided to classify XRP as a commodity, not just the CFTC. In accordance with the administration's executive directives, the Treasury Department, the SEC, and the digital asset working groups formed by the executive branch collaborated to reach this unified decision. Since the CFTC reached its own determination that XRP was a commodity, the categorization was not implemented. The administration arranged an interagency collaboration process, and that determination was its product. The institutional history of the CFTC's process for making important categorization judgments documents that plan. The date of the FedNow rollout is the third piece of evidence. In July 2023, coinciding with Ripple's legal triumph and the first substantial administration digital asset policy initiatives, the Federal Reserve debuted its FedNow fast payment system. FedNow took a long time to build. The debut was not coincidental with the digital asset policy schedule. The competitive landscape of digital assets was considered when the Fed made its internal judgment about the activation of FedNow. They timed their introduction to coincide with the widespread discussion of Ripple's cross-border technology, which allowed the Federal Reserve to have an argument ready for domestic payment modernization while the digital asset policy architecture was nearing completion. The timing shows that the top brass in the U.S. government's financial policy apparatus knew exactly where the plan was going with the digital asset regulation. The calendar of congressional testimony is the fourth piece of evidence. From the time of the Ripple SEC lawsuit until the present Clarity Act markup timeline, the order of congressional hearings on digital asset regulation follows a legislative development arc that is in line with a multi-year plan to amass the record required for digital asset legislation that will be permanent. It is not a coincidence that bills are introduced during congressional hearings. Legislators construct laws on purpose, creating a trail of evidence that lawmakers can use to defend their votes in front of voters and potential reviewers in the courts. After 2 years of work, the Clarity Act is now here. The record for it was built using a hearing calendar that was not improvised. Everything had been set up. The fifth and perhaps most disregarded piece of evidence is the most tangible. Early in this administration's tenure, the president issued an executive order mandating the creation of a uniform regulatory framework for digital assets. The order specifically asked the Treasury Department, the SEC, the CFTC, and other relevant agencies to work together on this matter. The Clarity Act's statutory wording, commodity categorization, institutional custody guidelines, ETF approval framework, and interagency coordination process were all born out of that order. The strategy is laid forth in the presidential decree. Following the framework that the previous executive order directed, the 8-war order that called the Bluff is an example of downstream execution. The strategy becomes clear when one reads the language of the Clarity Act in succession with the earlier and subsequent presidential orders. No one could ever deny it. The Federal Register published it. Because institutional positioning and the government's agenda are not parallel tales, I will now introduce the institutional dimension. Essentially, they are two versions of the same narrative given from separate perspectives. Without insight into the regulatory landscape, Goldman Sachs would not invest $154 million. The institutional investor has access to regulatory signals that retail investors do not due to Goldman's Washington connections, the revolving door of former Treasury secretaries, Federal Reserve officials, and SEC commissioners who work for both the firm and the government. The XRP investment at Goldman is not a wager on the arrival of regulatory clarity. It is a wager placed by individuals who have grasped the strategy and have positioned themselves appropriately. For years, Goldman's network has been amassing regulatory intelligence, and the $154 million is the commercial manifestation of that intelligence. Corporately, Bank of America has been expressing the same regulatory insight through its Ripple patent portfolio, which spans a decade. Because of their extensive network of contacts within all applicable regulatory bodies, the government relations team at Bank of America would have been privy to information regarding the interagency coordination procedure mandated by the executive order. At a regulatorily sensitive bank like Bank of America, the choice to construct a patent portfolio based on Ripple's technology necessitates board-level approval. Boards of member banks of the Federal Reserve do not give their stamp of approval to technology-based patent portfolio plans unless they have faith in the technology's regulatory future. According to Bank of America's government relations intelligence, the strategy was headed in the direction of XRP. Therefore, the board of directors gave their approval. JP Morgan's board and executive team knew the regulatory environment that the Onyx platform would operate in when they approved the capital investment in blockchain settlement infrastructure. The platform is now settling $1 billion daily on an EVM-compatible XRP ledger. Technology with an unclear regulatory future does not attract investments of such magnitude from JP Morgan. Blockchain settlement infrastructure would function inside a well-defined and encouraging regulatory framework, according to regulatory data that informed JP Morgan's leadership's decision to invest in Onyx. It was specified in the plan. BlackRock is planning its entry trigger for an XRP ETF at the $3 billion AUM level, which the CEO of Canary Capital has already indicated, while keeping in mind the regulatory schedule that the administration's plan is operating against. Among global asset managers, BlackRock's regulatory affairs staff has the strongest ties to the SEC. They use their institutional knowledge of the Clarity Act's legislative schedule, the implementation calendar of the presidential order, and the interagency coordination process that resulted to the commodity classification to influence their product development timeframe. BlackRock's strategy for the XRP ETF is well planned. Based on their regulatory knowledge, they are approaching it on a time frame that is in line with the plan's execution. There is harmony between the government's strategy and the institutional stance. In and of itself, such congruence proves the existence of the plan and the fact that the most powerful institutions have amassed it because they have the best access to it. Deciphering the plan's implications for cost is something I'll go into now. Why? Because the supply dynamics give rise to extremely potent price triggers as a result of the plan's implementation. Although there are 61.3 billion XRP tokens in circulation, only a small portion of that amount is accessible for institutional purchase at the present price point, known as the effective free float. Ripple plans to distribute 34% of its tokens programmatically every month. With on-chain holding durations measured in years, long-term whale wallets hold about 17%. 60% of present holders are sitting on unrealized losses because to cost bases that are higher than current prices. Until there is a significant recovery in prices, they will be a dormant supply. There isn't much free float, but there will be a lot of institutional demand when the strategy is put into action. Once the Clarity Act is enacted, the long-awaited legal framework will be in place for all institutional allocators. Funds that were held up throughout the institutional due diligence process's compliance stage are released all at once, in a wave rather than a trickle. Reason being, all institutions simultaneously have their legislative compliance questions answered, releasing the tsunami. Just because the Clarity Act is passed doesn't mean the supply goes higher. There is a need. Furthermore, there are constraints on the free float that needs to absorb that demand, which the present price does not take into account. Once BlackRock's regulatory intelligence and threshold approach make the filing for an XRP ETF a near-term event, the capital from pension funds, endowments, sovereign wealth funds, and insurance companies begins to flow into XRP through the institutional distribution network that BlackRock controls. In the first year of its launch, BlackRock's iShares Bitcoin ETF garnered $60 billion in assets. It appears that a different amount would be produced by a proportional reaction, given the market cap of XRP in comparison to Bitcoin at the time of the Bitcoin ETF debut. However, one cannot use proportional mathematics to infer the direction. A demand event is created by BlackRock's entrance, and the restricted free float must absorb it at whatever price, according to structural reality. The commercial thesis that all institutional analysts have been using as a basis for their adoption curve modeling becomes a proven fact when the first large bank announces the production deployment of Ripple's technology for their cross-border payment flows. Announcements of production by banks do not lead to a steady increase in price. The market's probability-weighted price for XRP with institutional bank adoption changes discontinuously when the adoption goes from projected to actual, which is why repricing events occur. I have an investment calculator that I can provide you, due to the fact that XRP holders require the results of the plan's decoding in order to use them. With a price of $142, you can get around 704 XRP with $1,000. These 704 tokens are worth $1,171 at $2.80, which is both Standard Chartered's short-term goal and the first significant resistance level in the institutional order book. The plan's execution suggests a repricing range of $5, which is worth $3,520 when the Clarity Act and BlackRock enter the market at the same time. They are worth $5,630 at $8, which is the upper limit of the near-term catalyst goal. Their current value is $8,448 at the $12 intermediate target, which is based on the assumption that the Bitcoin timeline is propelled by bank production announcements and institutional ratio fulfillment. For the case where the plan's institutional synchronization results in numerous banks making deployment announcements at the same time in the same quarter, the velocity model output is $20, which is worth $14,085. Their value is $19,118 at the $28 target that Standard Chartered has set for 2027 based on proven adoption curve study. In the best-case scenario, which counts the complete implementation of the plan, including the deployment of government procurement and the acceptance of CBDC bridges on a worldwide scale, their value increases to $35,200 from $50. For an investment of $5,000, multiply all figures by 5. Multiply by 10 when we reach 10,000. Then multiply that number by 25. The maximum downside from current pricing is around 10% due to the structural floor at 127, which is supported by over $400 million in on-chain cost basis. The approach has a proven analyst target upside of 200 to 3,400% when executed. A $154 million position was generated by Goldman's regulatory intelligence. Regulatory intelligence at Bank of America resulted in a patent portfolio that lasted for 11 years. Onyx was created by the Regulatory Intelligence Team at JP Morgan. The Regulatory Intelligence Team at BlackRock is working on a threshold strategy that is time-sensitive with the plan. Those who have the greatest access to the strategy are also the ones who are most actively trying to change it. There is a reason for that. Doing something based on deciphered knowledge before the market price reflects it is the logic of business. What follows is a description of the catalyst sequence that results from the deciphered plan. You can't hope to be in the right place at the right time unless you know the sequence of events. An important milestone on the path to plan implementation is the Clarity Act markup, which is scheduled for the latter part of April. There is no hope. Due to the impending midterm elections, this legislative event has already been set in stone with a confirmed sponsor, a confirmed committee timeline, and a determined deadline. In the event that the Clarity Act makes it through committee, all institutional allocators will no longer be required to do compliance analyses while they await legislative clarity. Capital is now being utilized rather than pending. The legislative wording of the Clarity Act is based on the executive authority that was established by the 8-0 Order's legal resolution, which was further enhanced by the challenge that called the Bluff. Due to the challenge's impact on the court record, the constitutionality of the Clarity Act is now better established than it would have been otherwise. The plan was reinforced, not weakened, by the called Bluff. Either the result was expected or it was deliberately planned. Either way, the outcome is a regulatory structure for XRP that is more legally durable than what was there before the challenge. As the plan moves from a regulatory narrative to a market narrative, BlackRock's threshold crossing legitimizes it. By the time BlackRock files, the idea has received such widespread institutional support that it can no longer be ignored by the mainstream financial media. The XRP filing by BlackRock is seen by all institutional investors as a confirmation of the plan's validation at the highest institutional level, even by those without access to regulatory intelligence from Goldman Sachs or Bank of America. It is not knowledgeable capital that deploys in reaction to that signal. Capital with permission. And the funding that BlackRock's filing authorizes comes from a massive institution. The last layer of the plan's execution is the government procurement announcements. The plan shifts from strategy to infrastructure when a government agency, such as Treasury, Defense, USAID, or another, announces the production deployment of Ripple's technology. This agency's international payment flows are in line with Ripple's capability. Strategy is temporary, while infrastructure is permanent. No amount of regulatory wiggle room or Clarity Act challenges will be able to undo a government contract for Ripple's payment technology. Everything works. Demand is compounded instead of oscillated by an operational infrastructure. What we have deciphered is not a hypothesis. Evidence for this may be found in the Clarity Act's legislative history, executive directives, regulatory filings, the institutional positions of Goldman, Bank of America, JP Morgan, and BlackRock, and so on. There was no blunder with the 8-0 Order. It was not a setback that the Bluff was called. They were steps in a process that would eventually lead to XRP's regulatory framework being stronger than what an executive order could have achieved on its own. I am running the plan. It is most heavily positioned among the institutions that have the best access to it. Furthermore, the market's present concern regarding the plan's reality is reflected in the XRP price of 142s. Indeed, it is. The paperwork is proof of it. It is validated by the actions of the institutions. Within the time limit that expires before the market as a whole grasps what has been transpiring, the deciphered strategy generates the most consequential catalyst sequence in XRP's history, which is currently underway. Major storms dissipate. Rugged construction endures. Hide the like button. Put your XRP holdings and thoughts on the timeline's impact of the 8-0 Order's resolution in the comments section. So far, this community has deciphered, sign up and give it a ring. Shortly after the first government procurement announcement lands, BlackRock files, and the Clarity Act moves, my summary goes up. They rolled the dice. The grip became firmer. You were present when the neighborhood learned the truth. We will meet again after this.